Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome to Season 2 of the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of the South African energy sector into digestible insights. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and today we're setting the scene for Season 2 of the podcast by bringing all our listeners up to speed with the latest developments in South Africa's energy policy. Energy policy plays a pivotal role in shaping the South African economy, influencing not only investment, but also ensuring that we have stable and sustainable power supply. With the recent developments in South African energy policy and regulations, as well as the notable improvement in electricity stability, this conversation couldn't be more timely. To help us unpack these challenges, I am joined by two esteemed guests, Professor Sampson Mamphweli, Head of the Energy Secretariat at the South African National Energy Development Institute, as well as Happy Khambule, who is the Energy and Environment Director at Business Unity South Africa. Welcome to you both. But before we dig into today's topic, I'd like us to just start with some brief introductions, and perhaps both of you could just share briefly about your roles in the energy sector and about the organizations that you both represent. Prof. Sampson, if I can start with you, please.
All right. Now, thanks, and thanks for having me. I'm based at the South African National Energy Development Institute, as you indicated. My role is basically to run the National Department of Science, Technology and Innovation's Energy Secretariat. We are assisting the department to run 4 RDI flagship programs that focus on carbon capture and utilization to prolong the life of the coal fleet, renewable and sustainable hub and spokes program that focuses on solar energy and wind energy technologies. The HISA program, which is Hydrogen South Africa, that focuses on the hydrogen economy in general, from research all the way to mega projects, as well as energy storage program that focuses on the development of precursor materials for lithium-ion batteries and then the development of battery packs, all the way to the utilization of the various battery packs. I'm also involved at SANEDI as an ExCo member, and I'm also involved in the policy side of things, where we advise the Minister of Energy and Electricity on the policy positions of South Africa. Right now, I'm doing this interview from Cape Town, where I just did a keynote address at the South African Wind Energy Association CEO breakfast that was focusing specifically on this particular topic, on the energy policy, as well as the reforms and what we can expect going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Happy, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
So my name is Happy Khambule, and I'm from Business Unity South Africa. I am the head of the department that looks at energy and environment policy. Specifically within the context of energy policy, our role is to champion the business interest in the emerging policy landscape and ensuring that legislative considerations factor in not only the concerns of business, but the key interests of a macroeconomic nature. We, as Business Unity, serve as the primary interlocutor with government on macroeconomic issues, particularly policy and legislation. We are the main interlocutor in NEDLAC, as well as in the ILO at the level, at the international level, even at the extent that we sit within the International Organization of Employers at the board, as well as within, obviously, the membership group of all employers around the world. Chiefly within the energy space, we are the ones who are running ahead with the government and business program, which is currently being coordinated by the Energy Council. We, as BUSA, are the ones who set it up and are essentially the primary interlocutors at the JSEC level and within the presidency arrangement. We also are the key interlocutors on many of the issues that require escalation, such as, when you have a situation where a particular intervention needs to be undertaken and you need business buy-in. We're the primary players that ensure that the business is convened in relation to the government request, but also that the key challenges are being addressed. For example, with Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, we were the ones that were trying to push for the unlocking of the renewable energy or the capacity cap that was in place. So we straddle a wide range of issues, but largely our key point is macroeconomic considerations that may occur if it's policy or legislative.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for those introductions. Let's kick off and get straight into the episode. Okay, let's start by understanding the big picture as it stands right now. The South African energy landscape has undergone some notable shifts and changes in the past year, and these changes do have far-reaching implications. Prof. Sampson, if I can start with you on this, could you maybe just set out for us and set out for our listeners what have been the most critical regulatory changes that we've seen in the past year?
Yeah, so there has been a number of changes dating back to the amendment to the Electricity Regulation Act. Initially, people who set up power systems that produce electricity up to 1 megawatt were required to have generation licenses. That was then removed, and then it was moved to 100 megawatts. And then later, the licensing requirements were removed completely. That had a huge impact in terms of the IPP space, because then it opened up an opportunity for IPPs to be able to play a meaningful role going forward in terms of electricity production, generation, and distribution. The licensing requirements were kind of a bottleneck because it used to take quite a long time to secure a generation license. So now what happens now is that if you want to produce electricity using renewable energy, all you need to do is basically to register your 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 generation plant with the National Energy Regulator. That is the one. The second aspect that has changed is the amendment of the act that led to the established the breaking up of ESCOM actually into three business units, so to speak, where we have generation being separate, and then you have the transmission separate, and then you have distribution separate. And then we had the establishment of the transmission system operator, that needs to set up a whole lot of things in terms of procurement of electricity from various sources, including independent power producers. There is the development of the market code, the new market that we are seeing that is coming into the picture, where the transmission system operator through its various subsidiaries, will be procuring this energy from independent power producers. That kind of opens up the market and allows participation from the private sector going forward. And that will then introduce competition to ESCOM and amongst the independent power producers, which is healthy and good for the prices, because the prices will then go down. It also attracts a lot of foreign direct investment, because many companies from the international point of view will then come in and invest in the renewable energy space, both in the manufacturing and assembly side of things, as well as the project development side of things. We have seen also with the implementation of the National Energy Crisis Committee Energy Action Plan, which is the President's Energy Action Plan. We've seen the implementation of small-scale embedded generation, which is basically rooftop solar PV, as well as ground-mounted solar PV by households and businesses. And that was because through the President's Energy Action Plan, government then provided subsidies to households that wanted to install solar PV so that we can deal with load shedding, so to speak, and also businesses. So those are some of the interventions that led to large scale kind of adoption of rooftop solar PV, as well as ground mounted photovoltaic systems. The ground mounted ones are mainly by the business community. And we've seen that sector growing to about 7 gigawatts of renewable energy in the form of solar PV installed in the country. And that assisted ESCOM greatly because during the day when the sun is shining, ESCOM is able to use the capacity that has been lowered from the grid to generate their reserves, the pumped storage and all other reserves during the day. So those are some of the general reforms that have happened in the past year. I would say dating back to about 2 to 3 years. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that overview and that summary, Prof. Happy, I'd like to hear from you and bring you into the conversation and really understanding then from a business perspective, how have these policy shifts influenced private sector participation in the South African energy market?
No, thanks for the question. And so the main thing is that it instilled a sense of confidence that there is a direction of travel which is consistent with the general political statements that have been provided in the country. I mean, we obviously have some challenges that still remain, but at a broader level, the direction of travel seems to be consistent, and that's something that we sorely needed with regards to confidence. One of the biggest areas or indicators that we've been tracking is how confident is business in ensuring that if capital and investments are made, that these are going to actually generate the necessary productivity as well as the rate of return that is associated with that investment. And there's a greater sense that, this government, this administration, the leadership within the energy department are going in that direction. The second part of this is that there is obviously hesitance within the business community to fully appreciate what the changes mean. And what I mean by that is, one is there is this momentum that is driving participation. There is the policy changes that are there, but there are structural or systemic barriers that are not able or that do not enable the actual full capitalization of the potential that is being contained within the business community. And I think that's something that we'll be working on for a number of years. But one of those areas, for example, which is quite key and will take a number of years, but if we get the right signals, will be unlocked quickly, is really the issue of the transmission grid. And I think from what the Prof has also indicated is that as a result of the integrated resource plan and the changes in the ERA, the idea that the transmission grid is also going to be opened up not only for private investment, but also use and access is quite a big deal. So until we are able to address that, not only at a distribution level, but at a transmission level, we might not be able to generate that, or rather to access that momentum potential that is already there. Then the other component is that I think a lot of companies and a lot of businesses have seen the ability of saying that, well, as we are unbundling and as the decisions to choose what kind of energy source are becoming more important, they can take some ownership in ensuring that they safeguard themselves around some of the risks that are associated with not only having electricity, but having a specific kind of electricity as well. So we're also having these kinds of consumer choices as indicators of saying that, well, are we moving in the right direction? We all know that the carbon content of our electricity is quite high, and that is one of the considerations that businesses take into account. But because of the changes in legislation, more companies are actually saying, hey, we're actually reducing the carbon content of the inputs that what we're inputting into the products and into the services that we're providing. There go also decarbonizing, at least at a slower rate or at a particular rate, our carbon content within the product. So that's a good sign as well, and it indicates that we're moving in the right direction, where the decisions are not only left to government to be able to ensure that the resilience and the competitiveness of the South African economy is still there, but also by the particular labor market and goods market players that are in the economy.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Happy. And I think also, beyond just looking at it from a policy perspective, another highlight that we've seen, in recent developments in the South African energy sector has been Eskom actually achieving over 300 days without load shedding. And I think it's a milestone that's really a testament to the leadership team and the work that's been put in, but at Eskom. And Prof. Sampson, I was wondering if maybe you could shed some light perhaps around what were some of the key drivers that have been behind the stabilization of Eskom?
Yeah, so the first thing was the changes in the leadership, with the group CEO appointing and giving the powers to the head of generation, and the head of generation appointing qualified power station managers and giving them powers to run things at power station level, as opposed to the previous regime where the power was centralized at Megawatt Park. That's the one thing. The other aspect is the implementation of the President's Energy Action Plan that has got 5 pillars. The first pillar is basically fixing the existing coal fleet so that it can work in line with the country's long-term energy plan, which is the IRP. So if you look at the IRP 2010, IRP 2019, both say that the coal fleet, the existing coal fleet, should operate at an energy availability factor above 70% or close to that 70%. And we had load shedding because the energy availability factor had collapsed and drastically. So with the new Minister of Electricity coming on board, being appointed by the president to focus specifically on fixing Eskom, that on the leadership side of things also assisted greatly. Then what happened was that government gave Eskom a relief, a financial relief, which is the shareholder equity injection of 256 billion rands, so that the Eskom can then use their balance sheet to fix the existing coal fleet. And that worked greatly, because then Eskom, that money managed to free up some money from Eskom, and then Eskom was able to do what we call reliability maintenance. That goes alongside what we call philosophy maintenance, which basically means that when they take down the various units for maintenance, when they bring them back, they work in a reliable manner. They are reliable to operate for quite a long time. Whereas in the past, when they take down these units and they fix them, when they return them to service, they were not guaranteed that they will work for quite a long time, which is why we started seeing load shedding disappearing for quite a long time. Those are some of the factors. Then there was the issue of the small scale embedded generation, rooftop solar PV, ground mounted solar PV, supported by the government tax incentives, as well as individuals who did not even go for the government tax incentives, who installed their own rooftop and ground mounted solar PV, and the businesses. That took away a huge chunk of the demand from the grid, especially during the day. And then Eskom is able to then use the excess capacity to generate reserves that they use for the evening peak shaving, basically dealing with the evening demand. So those are some of the factors that led to us not having load shedding. In the main, it was the maintenance of the coal fleet. We have seen that improving by plus or minus 10% from the time that the minister was appointed, from about 51% to around 61, 62%, which is quite positive. And if it stays there for quite a long time, we expect that load shedding will continue to be suspended. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess what we're seeing is that there actually is light at the end of this tunnel. And I guess again, considering it then from a business confidence perspective, and with energy insecurity long having been cited as a major operational risk for businesses doing business in South Africa. Happy, I'd like to bring you in here and just get your insights in terms of how has improved electricity stability affected industry, and what in your view are some of the lingering concerns that remain?
Obviously, with 300 days and such, no load shedding, the first thing that goes up, at least from what we're tracking, is consumer confidence that the services and the products that people are going to want to buy or access are going to be available, because operation and operating hours are going to be, are going to be there. That when you walk into the shop, you're not going to get the excuse that the tills are not working, or that you cannot be given a particular service because of load shedding. So that's a big thing. So the recovery of productivity is quite key. Obviously, we can only know within the next couple of months as to how far we are from the pre-COVID time, or when we were getting a little bit of a boom. But we are cautious about the sensitivity and the state of the system, because we did have a bout of load shedding, which was an extreme one, bearing in mind the different factors that led to that. But I think the first thing was that, look, there's a clear understanding and an appreciation that if people work together, particularly business and government and other social partners, we can get across the line, And I think one of the main things is that even the energy action plan that the Prof is referring to is also something that is also in partnership with business in trying to ensure that there's a little bit of help where necessary, wherever there's expertise that are required, that those expertise can be brought online, and also starting to front load some of those decisions that need to be made, like issues related to market codes and grid access and related. So I think there is confidence that if we work together, we can get over the line, which is a great thing, meaning that there's no problem that's insurmountable. And for going ahead, it makes it easy for us to be able to explain the story of South Africa, to say, look, actually, even though we were stuck in a quagmire for quite some time, we actually are able to get ourselves out, and we're putting lessons in place in order not to be stuck in that situation. The other part of this is that because there was a greater participation from the private sector now during this bout of load shedding versus what was happening in the early parts of 2000 and 2009, the appreciation of how much private sector can participate and provide solutions is also there. So what you start seeing is that even with the integrated resource plan, the amount which is, I wouldn't say earmarked, but the proportion or the contribution that's coming from the private sector is much bigger than it used to be. And it also is if not comparable, just as big as what the government is trying to build or bring in as new capacity. So that's something of a good sign as well, that we are also moving into this transition of a competitive market. One of the lingering fears or issues that are there is obviously the sensitivity of or the health of the system currently, because if one unit trips, like we have right now with issues related to Koeberg and such, and whatever happened, and also what happened with the other power stations 2 weeks ago, the system basically almost falls apart. So we are quite worried at the fact that it is still quite sensitive, if I put it like, not as stable as it needs to be. But the recovery and the actions that were undertaken by the system operator and the colleagues within Eskom was quite promising, and it showed a level of recovery that we haven't seen before. And the mere fact that the minister was also communicating provided that level of certainty that actually this thing can be addressed. The main concern that we have is that the demand for electricity from some of the primary sectors is nowhere close to the level that we are used to. And in a situation where you want to have an economy that is growing again and that is trying to recover from the many shocks that it has faced, you start to see that actually we are underperforming as an economy because even the level of demand that is going into the system doesn't actually match the aspirations that we have in trying to remedy some of the situations around productivity and output that we need to produce. So that is a concern when the mines come back online, starting to roll out and to be at least 100% or 80% productivity in terms of the rates and the volumes that they're taking out. Will the system be able to hold that? Even as much as all the investment has gone in by the private sector, particularly the mines and the manufacturing colleagues, to generate their own electricity, that's only a proportion of what actually they generate, they're demanding from Eskom. So Eskom still needs to be there. We still need the generation fleet. We still need the system to keep on going whilst we ensure that at least some of the other resilience initiatives are being put in place. So that's a big worry, that when the demand comes back and picks up again, will the system hold? Starting to see signs that it might not be the case because we're not adding enough capacity to the grid to be able to tap that potential that's still latent.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I guess also highlighting a very key element in terms of just overall grid stability being very key in South Africa's energy sector and in the development and in the growth of it. And it's not just the stability of it. When you touch on and speak about private sector participation in electricity generation, it then speaks to the fact that not only do we need to have a stable grid, but it needs to allow for access, especially then by private sector players in the introduction of renewable energy. And South Africa has obviously got some very ambitious clean energy targets, but the grid remains a key challenge in us being able to achieve that. Professor Sampson, I'd like to hear from you, and I mean, you rightly touched on the IRP a bit earlier in your feedback, and in the IRP there's some significant targets that have been put in terms of the extension or the construction of additional transmission lines. Just to hear from you though, what progress has been made in expanding grid capacity so that it does then enable the participation of independent power producers?
Yeah, so the IRP relies on the Eskom Transmission Development Plan. The Eskom Transmission Development Plan appreciates the fact that we need to build about 14,000 kilometers of lines of the grid, and then it basically sets out how South Africa will respond to that. In terms of the technical planning side of things, we need about close to 400 billion rands investment into that particular sector. Now, what the Minister of Energy and Electricity has done, he has looked at the possibly funding that from the Eskom balance sheet, and realized that it's not going to be possible because we need to move with speed to build those lines. And then what we did, or what the team did that developed the IRP, was to basically look at the grid capacity at substation level, and then they ran their model based on availability or available capacity at substation level. We do have available capacity at substation level, but on the transmission line side of things, that's where the 14,000 kilometers of lines kick in. Now, the assumption in the IRP is that based on the fact that we've got the transmission development plan and we've got capacity at substation level, the grid capacity will be built over the next number of years. And then what the minister did was, because he realized that we cannot build it out of the Eskom balance sheet, he came up with a model that then bring in the private sector role players. I must indicate that the private sector has played a huge role in the dealing with load shedding, ensuring that we've got security of energy supply. Both at NECOM level, National Energy Crisis Committee, as well as through capacitating the state to deal with some of these issues. And now the minister's plan is that we will then have to procure some of these services for grid expansion from the private sector in a model that is much more similar to the model that we are implementing when we purchase renewable energy from independent power producers. There are a number of actions that the minister will be taking. I think there will be an RFP for 3 transmission lines to begin with quite soon, and then from there he will then take that through the process of the ministerial determination that he needs to do, the NERSA concurrence, and then the at the end of the day, it will be a public procurement process, bringing in the private sector to play a much bigger role when it comes to building of the grid. What we envisage will happen is that there will be a build, operate, and transfer kind of a model where the private sector will build these 14,000 kilometers of lines or whatever number of lines that the government will determine, operate them for a particular period where they will have to reach their return on investment, get their money back and make the minimum allowable profit. And then once that happens, then they will have to transfer the infrastructure back to the nation, and then we can then have some time of using the grid as a nation as well. So there are a number of initiatives to deal with the grid issues, and obviously in remote areas, the minister is looking at bringing in things like your mini grids, where you go and build a grid for a community, for instance, using solar PV and wind energy, but bringing in again the private sector to play a role in that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And clearly a lot of opportunities that are presented then for the private sector in terms of helping South Africa meet its electricity demands and obviously the necessary infrastructure improvements. What I'd like to also understand is obviously the challenge is we still do need to increase the amount of investment that's being made in renewable energy investments in order for us to actually be able to meet the demand from an electricity supply perspective. And I'd like to hear from you then, Happy, from a private sector perspective, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you're seeing in terms of your members from them being able to roll out the necessary renewable energy investments, and what policy interventions could really make a difference in moving things along in this area?
There are a number of issues that still remain, and one of them is what we call the transmission grid is also divided into two, right? We'd have the distribution network, and then we have the actual grid that traverses the entirety of the country. And areas related to grid access, or rather, let's say the local distribution network, rules relating to that are not uniform. And there are obviously steps trying to ensure that at least there is some form of common way to approach it, because different municipalities, different distributors tend to use different rules because of the way in which they're structured, as well as the place within the political system in that particular jurisdiction. So we need uniformity of rules. That's, I think, across the board, particularly on the distribution side. Second part is we've had for quite some time companies in the IPP sector that in the initial rounds of the REI4P program were essentially, they would know where the substation is or the closest point of connection is, and they will build more or less around that. And there will be a discussion as to how you connect them, then those get connected. As the issue around transmission and the fiscal position of the transmission operator became much more apparent, meaning this time Eskom, some of those were requested to then, no, get the lines from your plant all the way to the point of connection. Now you have a situation where even the point of connection in terms of where it might be located as per the TDP is not actually there. So you then have to get whoever might be that particular IPP then also to build and then also connect themselves to that particular point of connection ensuring that by the time the TDP comes, there's something there along those lines. And I'm being very, very loose about the situation, but that's just the high level around it. Now, the situation that we're finding is that without proper rules to be able to apply that, and I think most companies are fine with being able to do that because they understand the situation that South Africa faces. But if you are going to ask for additional investment on the current investment that is being put into, let's say, the PPAs and the agreements that have been put in place, there has to be some form of corresponding adjustment in terms of concessions or allowable incentives. And if we do not have that, we'll have a situation where there will be a material interest in a common piece of infrastructure which should be owned by the state, however, being developed by the private sector, because there are no rules being associated with ensuring that people are being compensated fairly, and on the same time that access is allowed, then we're going to have a tension that applies. And I don't want to say what that tension might look like because we're not necessarily clear. But what has started to appear is that people are hesitant to bid in certain areas, even though the resource might be prime, even though that the community is clearly the most ideal, because of this fact that you have to make additional investments without a corresponding incentive or allowable instrument to ensure that you're not just sinking an investment and then at the end of the day you cannot sweat it or use it within the rules that you may have been provided. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. The second one is at the distribution level. We have this situation where there's a secondary market for traders, right? And I'll say secondary because the biggest trader here, for all accounts, is Eskom, right? In its different business optimized processing that it has. Now, the secondary group of traders who basically pooled an amount of electricity and make up a set of transactions in order to sell on to a particular customer, where you've got a willing buyer on one end and a willing seller on the other end, where the power plant might be in a different place within that jurisdiction, and then the buyer is on a different place. The rules to access that are not clear. And how you go about doing that, whether you go to the grid access unit first versus going to the regulator, is still not clear. So every time someone makes an application, that application is treated on a case-by-case basis without having a clear understanding. And what that means is that the cost of doing business or the cost of that project are exponentially increased because of the different pieces of people that need to come in. You have to get consultants, you have to get lawyers, you have to just pad the whole transaction cost in order just to get a simple set of pieces of paper that give you the license and the rights to be able to pool those particular pieces of energy and then effect a particular transaction. The last one, and I think Prof kind of alluded to it, is that we're going to have a situation where we're going to have a transmission company that might be working in concert with multiple transmission companies as well, as a result of them building and owning and then eventually transferring. The problem we are finding, or at least that we foresee, is that in the midst of the transmission company being as it is, if it is not independent, it's going to still maintain the market dominance of Eskom. And that means that the same problems that we have at a distribution level, we will still have even in the means of trying to dispatch available power through the transmission grid or the system operator choosing which pieces of electricity to use in order to ensure to satisfy demand. Now, that's a problem. Because if it's not independent per se, what's going to happen is that you're going to always prioritize the fleet that comes from the parent company, and in this case would be the coal fleet. And we know that in this current context within where we are sitting in the global economy, the most thing we need is green attributes or green credits being as much as possible being contained within our electricity system, because that enables us to be able to contain and to keep our trading partners happy about the products that we're producing, but also keeps us competitive by the fact that our electricity is expensive, yes, but it's not as expensive as other countries. But on top of that, it is also greener. So those are the issues that we are seeing related to the grid. The independence of the transmission operator, the system operator, is quite key, especially as we move into this model where you've got to build and own with the private sector. Grid access rules are quite key, and also ensuring that there's uniformity across the board and how you're treating the traders.
Thank you very much for those insights. I think, in this conversation, we've covered a number of topics or a number of key touch points, so looking at the regulatory developments at this point in time, getting a sense or understanding the stabilization of Eskom's electricity supply, and also just touching on a very key element, the grid, and this grid then being the backbone in us actually being able to deliver the power to the different industries. And I think also, Happy, what you've touched on is, in all of these considerations, whether the grid is up to scratch, whether we've got the right policies, we've got, whether we're making the right developments from a regulatory perspective, it all really speaks to, the broader investment climate and the future outlook of the South African energy sector, and that's really, it's driven by the fact that energy investment is a key pillar of South Africa's transition, and obviously what becomes important there is we need to have that policy certainty in order for us to be able to attract the capital that would be required to invest, whether in generation projects or in transmission infrastructure, and I want us to consider, looking, as we look ahead to the rest of 2025 and beyond, what should investors and stakeholders that have a keen interest on the South African energy sector, what should they anticipate? And Prof. Sampson, I want to get your views here in this in unpacking what major policy changes or regulatory shifts should we be keeping an eye on as South Africans?
Yeah, so we have changed a lot in terms of the regulations and the policy positions. I don't expect that there will be major changes on the regulatory side of things, and then on the policy side of things. There are two things that will be critical going forward. The first one is the Eskom retail tariff plan. That has now been approved by the National Energy Regulator. With that retail tariff plan, people with small-scale embedded generation, rooftop solar PV, will be able to trade their electricity through the Eskom lines. So you can feed whatever you produce, which is more, back to the grid, and then when you use the electricity, Eskom will only charge you the difference, and for the excess, they can then be able to pay you back the money. You can also decide to go completely off the grid by installing your own rooftop solar PV with a battery bank, and then you just disconnect Eskom. So there's a number of things, positive things that are coming with the new retail tariff plan. In the past, Eskom was proposing that people who use the grid in a manner that I have described will have to then pay for the services. Now the new retail tariff plan has changed, so that will come with a lot of changes in the sector going forward. The second part is the fact that we have now the draft integrated resource plan 2024. I was the reviewer of the document. SANEDI participated in terms of taking the document through the public participation process and analyzing the inputs from the public and assisting the ministry in that regard. Now, the draft integrated resource plan has proposed what we call the technology share, and it's got various scenarios where it's looking at the decarbonization of the South African electricity market going forward. We have seen a lot of wind that has been proposed, wind energy. I think it's up to 20 gigawatts or so. And then we've seen a lot of solar energy coming in. The IRP also took into consideration the fact that we have small scale embedded generation or rooftop solar PV. that will be installed between now and 2030 or 2035 by the public, which will still need to use the same network. So that's on the on those on that side. I just need to also indicate that ESCOM has also developed what we call the wheeling framework, because they then appreciated some of the challenges that we had in the past when it comes to grid access, and that was also in anticipation of the new market. Now, the other thing is that with the new market that's coming on board, we have a proposed what we call multi-market model. And that multi-market model is intended to deal with some of the challenges that we anticipated with the unbundling of ESCOM. For instance, with ESCOM transmission, yes, we all appreciate and understand the fact that it needs to be an independent company, and it is an independent company, the transmission system operator. So the way the market has been proposed, if this will be the market at the end, you have various market segments that basically takes care of energy security. They also take care of the decarbonization side of things. They also take care of the fact that we need to have ancillary services and grid strength. Now, if you look at all that, you have and for example, you have the market that we call the day ahead, which basically looks at the current electricity that we need across. We call it across wire today, which is the electricity that we need to fire the economy as we speak. So that will be the one market segment, and then you have what we call the day ahead reserve market. So that particular market is a market where you then project to say, if we need to have generation reserves, say for instance, one unit trips at Mitupi or whatever power station, or at Majuba power station, like what happened last time. Instead of the system collapsing the way it happened to a level where we had to put the country at stage 6 load shedding, this particular market will provide us immediately with the reserve. So we'll call on the reserve, and then the system will basically be corrected before it actually collapses. So that's another market segment. So when ESCOM, the transmission system operator, buys electricity, calls on these different market segments, they will be looking at what is it that we're looking for and who can give us that particular market segment. And then we have what we call the balancing market, for instance. This is the real-time delivery of power. So the system operator sits and look at and balances between the demand and the supply, so that the demand does not exceed the supply. Now, when you start to have challenges on the supply side of things, it affects your entire power system. It affects your frequencies. It affects your voltages and all that, and that results in multiple failures in the power system. Now, this particular market will be focusing on balancing that particular system. So when they purchase this electricity, they will then have to look at what is it that we want to achieve. Are we looking for the day ahead? Are we looking for the day ahead reserve? Are we looking at balancing the system? And then you have what we call the capacity market as well, which is the firm power that can be called on whenever it's needed, and that there are IPPs in the space that are already saying we are ready to invest in these various market segments, as long as they are explicitly clear in terms of what is it that the transmission system operator will be doing going forward. So those are some of the things that we anticipate will start to be implemented going forward, and there will be a need for the blockchain and the use of the fourth industrial revolution, blockchain technologies, so that we can be able to call upon these different various markets as and when they are needed. And I really appreciate the fact that it is really true that the transmission system operator will have to be independent of Eskom and then make decisions based on these proposed market segments. And if they stick to that, there is no risk of them prioritizing Eskom. Eskom will provide us with base load, obviously, and it falls within part of the market segments that I have described. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that input, Prof. Sampson. And I think touching on a point that Happy had made in terms of the fact that, it is quite important that, there is a level of independence and that there's no priority given to, the parent company or Eskom power in once this market is up and running. And I think also another point that you've made that's actually quite exciting, especially for, often in these energy conversations, the conversations generally, they'll be focused quite on what's happening in business or what's happening from a regulatory or government perspective. But I think it's quite an interesting insight then for, your ordinary residential user and residential consumers that have then installed their solar on their systems and potentially this introduction then of a retail tariff plan that could be quite exciting. Happy, just in terms of and Prof has also just said the IPPs are ready to invest. There is an improvement in investor confidence. But, you touched on and you did mention that there are some structural challenges, and you also noted that the current policy environment does need some work and some gaps have been identified for it to actually be able to really drive the necessary investment that's necessary for the South African sector. And I was wondering if you can perhaps maybe just expand a bit or share with us what's your thinking in terms of how can some of these gaps really be addressed effectively.
No, yeah, thanks. And always hearing the Prof speak is good. And when I get a chance to to push back a little bit, I'll try. And I think one of the things that is still permeating is we do not have an updated electricity pricing policy. And the one that is currently being used is the one that is pre-unbundling and pre-ERA, pre the introduction of IPPs as a firm fixture of the electricity system. And I think that's something that needs to occur, because the importance of an electricity pricing policy is that it gives the regulator at least a sense in terms of policy positions which it can use and need to implement with regards to how it makes its decisions on the pricing applications that are going to come not only now from Eskom, but from a variety of generators and I guess the system operator in this case. So there are key tenets in there that are quite key. One of those is, how do you represent information to a consumer based on their consumption as well as the price in which they're paying? Many times we've always been complaining that we don't know what we're really paying for in terms of electricity. We're on one side, Eskom, the utility, saying you're not paying the full cost of electricity, and then on the other side, the municipality saying, well, even if we do pay on whatever amount that you are paying on, we're not going to be able to continue to safeguard the distribution network that we actually use to give you households and businesses access to the overall system. So there's something there that needs to be done around the EPP, and I believe the minister is working on that, and probably obviously the colleagues in SANEDI are on that. Well, on the IRP, one of the issues that are relating to the IRP, which we think can be addressed quite quickly, is that it is impossible, if not more difficult, to make technology allocations on the basis of a system that is highly competitive. Because what it does is that the provider of the solution is the one that can decide what is the optimal design as well as the mix of the particular kinds of technologies to satisfy a particular piece of what is required under that determination. So if the minister comes again this year or next year after the IRP has been adopted and now has been promulgated or gazetted as the final one, other than the draft that's sitting in NEDLAC right now, and makes a determination to say we're going to need 2,000 or 5,000 gigawatts or megawatts of solar, it doesn't lend itself to a dynamic multi-market. What it does is that it forces technology options in a situation where the providers of the actual technology or the solutions should be the ones who are giving a sense of what is, going to be the optimal design. Because as part of the determination, the minister and the utility need to balance a number of things: reliability, affordability, dispatchability. All of those things need to come into question. Now, if you're going to say I'm only going to get solar power and it has to have batteries with it, you're actually pushing out certain players, but also you kind of forcing us in a particular direction. It's very different than in other countries where you essentially say, for this period of time, the IRP or the energy planning instrument that you're using is saying that it needs 10 gigawatts of electricity. What does the market say? Right? Least cost in mind, decarbonization in mind, whatever the criteria may be, then you allow the market to produce the most apt version of what is there. Then you're melding together not only the private sector, but also the public sector programs in such a way that you actually get the security of supply. Because what we have now is two tiers. You have the public sector driven approaches, is the REI4P, which has its challenges, but is one of the best programs in the world. And then you've got the private sector one, which is basically uncapped, where a willing buyer or willing seller can just build whatever they want, and then they just use the transmission grid or distribution network, pay the necessary costs, and hopefully if it works, then the person gets the power that they want. Or if it's behind the meter, they can work out whatever arrangement that they want. And that's not conducive in ensuring that the national interest is actually held at the center of the decision making. Because if you have this two-tiered system, one market might just go ahead of the other, and then you're going to have to start tapping that at a premium in order to be able to access what's there. Because if one folds, then the other one will have to take up the backlog or whatever the residue is. And I think the IRP needs to lend itself to the realization that yes, private sector is playing a big role, which it does pretty clearly, and because of the fiscal position that Eskom is in, it cannot do certain particular things. But if it has to be adaptive and also consummate with the current changes in the world, it has to change the way in which it's allocating the determinations and making those technology choices. Whether or not it can say that we are prioritizing CCUS for coal and whatever, I think that's part of the decision-making matrix, but allow the market to provide the kinds of solutions that it wants. Because if Eskom wants to build a gas-fired power station and the only gas-fired determination is going to come after 5 years, it's going to take a while before that business case is actually made explicit. So then if it can provide that business case in the immediate because of a determination for required capacity, that changes the dynamic. Then the last one I think is more integrated within the customer classes that are in Eskom or within the electricity system. The cross-subsidization issue, which kind of touches on the electricity pricing policy, but it's really about the retail tariff plan, is that cross-subsidization between customer classes is also an issue, particularly when you start putting in specific subsidy charges. And what tends to happen is that because traditionally you would have very low electricity prices, even for large industrial users, and then have marginal or average prices for customers, that has kind of started to switch, where the market now is basically saying that, no, you're going to pay for what you use. And if you want a special dispensation, you have to go through the negotiated pricing agreements, which are also not that great, that immensely used. It's very few companies that use those, which kind of puts pressure on the average price. So the cross-subsidization component needs to be addressed within the RTP and especially within the EPP, so that you're not creating a situation where one customer class is actually taking on the burden largely for non-performance or non-payment or under recovery from another customer class, and then essentially making sure that whatever you under recover on one customer class can be front-loaded in future tariffs for another customer class. And I think that's something that is still holding back some of the key investments that need to come into the country, primarily from the manufacturing side of things.
Thank you very much for that. Some really wonderful insights that have been shared by both our guests, and this really has been a very insightful discussion. I think for anybody that is looking at or interested in the South African energy sector, this has really been a lovely conversation, just to, one, bring us up to speed in terms of where do we sit from a regulatory perspective, but two, what does that actually mean for us, and where do these gaps still exist? And I'd like to wrap up this episode with some concluding remarks from our guests. And firstly, Prof. Sampson, if I can start with you and getting from you, if there's one key takeaway from this discussion that you believe energy stakeholders should keep in mind, what would that be?
The first thing is the fact that government has made quite a lot of reforms, and those reforms are positive. Government is working very closely with the private sector, and government continues to open up the space for private sector participation. What we know is that there is no single model in the whole world that is perfect. There are models that we can adopt that are country specific, that can assist us as a country going forward. I would like to comment briefly on the impact of the new market on long-term energy planning, because SANEDI is charged now with that responsibility of long-term energy planning, the IEP, the IRP, the gas master plan, and all other things. Now, the fact now that we're facing is that we have been doing long-term energy planning in the manner that we have done, without necessarily incorporating the implications of the reforms that have been forthcoming. For instance, the market that I've described, the proposed market that I've described, will dictate certain things, and it will also dictate that we do things differently from the way we used to do. And I want to agree with Peter that we might have to look at how best can we approach the IRP model. And just this morning, I had a discussion with some private sector stakeholders who brought that to my attention as well, to say, look, we would like to see a situation where the market dictates what happens. And if you look at the various market segments that I talked about, those market segments will basically dictate what happens in the space, even though transmission system operator will still be taking a lead in terms of which market to call on based on what they require at the particular point in time. So what I'm acknowledging at the end is the fact that the IRP planning as a dynamic kind of a process is a process that we need to come together as the private sector and the government, and look at how best do we then adapt this IRP planning process to respond to the changing local and global market conditions. And that, I think, is something that public entities have already acknowledged, to say we need to start looking at that. The other thing that I would like to conclude with is, when it comes to long-term energy planning, what we've been doing as a country was to wait for events to happen, and those events then determine what we do in terms of updating of the IRP. We have now learned that that is not necessarily the best approach because, for instance, when the technology prices change rapidly within a year or two, and then we delay to update the IRP, and then we start updating the IRP, it takes us about plus or minus 2 years to run the IRP model. And in that 2 years, the problem that you're trying to solve has evolved. The pricing has changed. The performance of the ESCOM fleet has changed. For instance, when we started with IRP 2024, we started in 2023 as IRP 2023. The performance of the ESCOM fleet was sitting at about 51% energy availability factor. And when you run the model, it then tells you that you need to build a lot of capacity. You have challenges in terms of your base load and security, and that then translates to insecurity of energy supply. And then you run the model, you finish. When we're done running the models, the energy availability factor of the coal fleet was now sitting at close to 60%. It changes the whole thing because you've been running this thing for quite a long time. So based on some of those experiences, we then took a decision to say, as SANEDI leading the energy planning unit on behalf of national government, we will, in the background, keep updating this information so that if we get to a level where there's a big, I would say, tectonic plate that results in a big shift in something that affect our energy plan, we can easily incorporate that into the energy plan within a very short space of time. And that can then assist the minister when it comes to making those ministerial determinations that will assist us so that we don't see ourselves in darkness. So those are some of the things that we're doing. However, we also, like I indicated to the business part of the business community that I was addressing today, we also welcome the inputs from society in general, including the business community, to say we appreciate what you are doing or what you've been doing as the public service. There are improvements that you can do in XYZ, and then those we will take forward when we do the long-term energy planning. And in some cases, we will have targeted kind of stakeholder engagements so that we plan better going forward as a country. But lastly, there is a lot of hope for South Africa. We are very much confident that at the end of the day, we will deal with the security of energy supply as a collective, as a country, going forward. I appreciate the fact that as things stand, the economy is kind of waking up from the COVID-19 pandemic, from the high levels of or intensive load shedding. We expect that there will be ramp up in production as things start to move. Because when we have no load shedding, then businesses start to ramp up production and things like that. But we are hopeful that with the new integrated resource plan coming on board, and working with both communities and the private sector, we will be able to provide and security of energy supply as South Africa. And most people, even the international community, people who talk to us, they've been indicating that it looks like there is hope in the fact that that particular issue will be resolved sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Prof. Sampson. And I think really highlighting an important point regarding the IRP, because, we can't keep having such a delay in the finalization of a new IRP when the situation actually, when the circumstances that were actually modeled for are able to change so significantly. And I guess it speaks to the fact that the IRP document really is a living document. It is one that needs constant feedback and constant collaboration to that point. And I think that the point really is that we should not be reacting to challenges, but instead we should really be making a concerted effort to plan for them. And I also, I like what you're saying in that inputs are welcomed, because I think, it's, many heads around one issue and many different viewpoints, and taking into account the viewpoints of different stakeholders will really help us to getting the solutions that really are workable and are and I guess workable for our common collective goal, which is really around South Africa Inc. and really ensuring that we've got a sustainable and secure electricity supply. And Happy, I guess, touching on what Prof has said, because he has said that, input is welcomed. So what would you then say, and what are the key actions that you think policymakers should take to ensure that that South Africa's energy transition remains on track, and that we actually do have energy security and a sustainable energy sector?
Maybe directly in response to the Prof. I mean, when it was announced that SANEDI would be the one who's quarterbacking the technical work and running the process, I think there was no hesitance from primarily the private sector organized business to say, well, that makes sense. It's been a long time coming. So I think the capacity that's been provided for by SANEDI is greatly welcomed, and I mean the quality of the outputs since then has been much better. I would say better. I'm not saying that others were not good, but has been much better. But we do have a gripe with SANEDI that it didn't invite us to the stakeholder engagement. So we're hoping that our comments were that good that we didn't need to explain them. But in answering your question directly, what we've been pressed with is, how do we ensure that in this transition period, the statements of intention are actually being realized? And we know that not everything is going to happen at one go, but you need to show the necessary signs. So at a macro level, we're going in the right direction. But when we drill down a little bit more sectorally and maybe if I say sector, it doesn't make sense, but on the individual functions and the pillars that hold up the system, there's still some deep concerns that are there. And what we want to be able to say, at least to policymakers, and now SANEDI is a direct policymaker and decision maker in this regard, is that we need to necessarily do as the Prof is saying, that look, it has to be more dynamic. Fully agreed that the iteration of the IRP is way too long, but that is also because where it comes from, its original design came from a specific kind of way of dealing with similar issues, where the bureaucracy knew that a decision by the bureaucracy or the administration, whether it's the executive or the administration, is going to be affected by state-owned enterprises or companies in a way that would allow at least a period of time for mainstreaming and consultation and all of that. And now we've changed. Right, things are a little bit more dynamic, and I appreciate what the professor is saying, is that look, as time goes on, the design is going to be changed. The key here is that if we're saying that we're going to introduce private sector participation, we need to ensure that we still safeguard the captive customers within the Eskom complement. And what I'm trying to indicate is that as much as there is private sector participation, it is nowhere near the level of Eskom, right? In terms of the customer base, as well as the actual installed capacity, the current capacity that we have in the country. So the customers, particularly the businesses and the households that are getting electricity from Eskom, shouldn't be shortchanged as a result of going through this transition period. And I think that's something that broadly the private sector is appreciative of, because the last thing we need is another tinderbox in a highly constrained social environment that we currently have. We've been adequately stating and consistently been communicating that our position on the electricity reform is not privatization, but it is competition. And if the outcome of electricity regulation reform becomes that the primary customers, the captive customers, are left in the lurch and are worse off, then the problems that we've been facing in terms of the reform and how it's been communicated are going to be realized, and then there's going to be a rejection of this whole process. So we want to be circumspect around how we go around this and ensure that there's protection. Then the last one is the concerns related to residential solar power. It is quite good that the Prof has also indicated that, look, it's actually going to Eskom is going to abandon what it wanted to do, and there's going to be a new model and a new way of dealing with that. What we aren't adequately dealing with is the situation of municipalities, because most of the customers that we have in general tend to be either Eskom or a local municipality utility that serves as a distribution or a distributor. Now, Eskom is getting its house, it's in order because it's being unbundled in that way. But the level of complexity that the municipalities are facing is far higher, because at the same time they do not have the necessary competence in some cases because of just the number of vacancies that they may have, or technical capability, because they're not clued up on the actual changes that are occurring. They do not have a SANEDI to go to, like the department and Eskom has. So that's a big problem, because those who are captive customers within those municipalities are going to be left behind, where the system is falling apart, not because of Eskom, but because of municipalities' inability to maintain the system or to get the administrative processes rolling. So that's one of the key areas that we think policymakers need to be focusing on, particularly this electricity distribution reform map that focuses on municipalities.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that input. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. A huge thank you to our guests for sharing their insights. This has really been an incredibly valuable conversation that I think a lot of us will keep listening to, because there's a lot of insights and a lot of gems that have been shared. For our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please do join the discussion on our social media platforms. And don't forget to subscribe to the Energy Conversation podcast so that you never miss an episode. Until next time, let's keep the conversation going. Goodbye. Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe, and let's shape South Africa's energy future together.